EDO. We are back on Nasser Road, October 6th, 1981. The parade has been moving for nearly an hour. The crowd is enormous, festive, draped in colors of an Egyptian holiday, military bands, dignitaries, the pageantry of a nation saluting itself. Anwar Sadat is in his usual position on the reviewing stand, slightly forward, slightly elevated, the posture of a man who has spent his life being watched and learned early on to give the watcher something worth seeing. The jet fighters come first. 4 Mirage F-1s in tight formation screaming directly overhead, trailing red, white, and black smoke, the colors of the Egyptian flag, in long, dissolving ribbons across the October sky. Every head on the reviewing stand tilts upward. Every set of eyes follows the jets. And this is by design, not Sadat's design. Below on the ground, a flatbed truck towing a Soviet-made artillery piece slows as it approaches the reviewing stand. This is normal. The vehicle's slow, the soldiers render honors, Sadat stands to acknowledge the salute. A man in an Egyptian army lieutenant's uniform stands in the truck bed and hurls a grenade directly at the reviewing stand. 3 other men leap from the truck behind him, opening fire with Kalashnikovs. In the next 45 seconds, Anwar Sadat will be struck 4 times by bullets and by more than 30 fragments of grenade shrapnel. He will be evacuated by helicopter to Mahdi Military Hospital. At 2:40 in the afternoon, he'll be pronounced dead. The man who threw the grenade and led the charge was 24 years old. His name was Khaled Islambouli. He was a first lieutenant in the Egyptian army. He'd been put on the truck by the Egyptian military's own parade assignment process, an assignment that a senior military officer in military intelligence had deliberately arranged, and for which that same officer had ensured the routine ammunition checks were never carried out. The question of how thoroughly this conspiracy had penetrated the institutions that were supposed to protect Sadat, and what the full answer to that question has cost the world in the decades since, is what this episode is ultimately about. Welcome back to the Ides of April. This is The Parade, the Assassination of Anwar Sadat, Episode 2. If you've been listening and haven't yet followed the podcast, please do it now, wherever you get your audio and on our social channels and on YouTube. It keeps stories like this one alive. Chapter 4 of that story begins now. The Cell. In Act 3 of Shakespeare's Hamlet, the prince delivers a line that has been used to justify more ideological violence than perhaps any other sentence in the entirety of the English language. There is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. Shakespeare meant it as a statement about the prison of the mind, Hamlet's particular and paralyzing hell in which his own relentless thinking has made Denmark feel like a cage. But removed from its context and placed in the hands of a man who has convinced himself that murder is a religious obligation, the line becomes something else entirely. It becomes a permission structure. If nothing is inherently good or bad, then thinking is everything. And if you can be made to think that God demands the death of a tyrant, then the killing isn't a murder, it's duty. And this is the logic that built the cell that killed Anwar Sadat. The theological foundation had been laid years earlier by a man named Muhammad Abd al-Salam Faraj, a civilian electrical engineer and ideologue of Egyptian Islamic Jihad, who wrote a pamphlet called Al-Farida al-Ghaiba, The Neglected Duty. Faraj argued, with the cold precision of a man who believed he had found a gap in the fence of Islamic jurisprudence, that violent jihad against apostate Muslim rulers was not merely permitted, but obligatory, a religious duty that the mainstream Islamic establishment had been deliberately suppressing. His target was not the distant enemy of Western imperialism. His target was the near enemy, the Muslim ruler who had betrayed Islam from within. His target, though he named no names in the pamphlet, was Anwar Sadat. The religious authorization for the killing came from Omar Abdel Rahman, the blind sheikh, a cleric of genuine scholarly standing whose rulings carried weight in Islamist circles across Egypt. Abdel-Rahman issued a fatwa authorizing the assassination. He would later claim the fatwa was issued in the abstract, without specific application to Sadat. Egyptian courts did not find that argument persuasive. He was convicted, though he received a lighter sentence than the men who pulled the triggers. Years later, serving a life sentence in an American federal prison for his role in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, Abdel-Rahman would insist that he had been misunderstood. The record suggests otherwise. The personal trigger for the cell's formation was immediate and specific. Khaled Islambouli's brother, Mohammed, had been arrested in Sadat's massive September 1981 roundup, the sweep that had netted over 1,500 people, from Islamist militants to Coptic clergy to secular journalists, anyone Sadat believed was destabilizing his government. That roundup missed a jihad cell in the military led by Lieutenant Khaled Islambouli, who would succeed in assassinating Anwar Sadat that October. Islambouli took his brother's arrest as the final, personal confirmation of everything Faraj had argued. The tyrant had to go, and Islambouli had, by the grace of a military parade assignment, the means to make it happen. On the morning of October 6th, 4 men were on that truck. Islambouli led them. He'd smuggled the grenades onto the vehicle himself, concealed in a military bag. He had told his co-conspirators only what they needed to know, and only when they needed to know it. He had, by all accounts, the specific and purposeful calm of a man who's made peace with what he's about to do. When the truck slowed and the jets screamed overhead and the heads of the reviewing stand tilted toward the sky, Islambouli stood, pulled the pin, and threw. The 45 seconds that followed were, by every eyewitness account, a scene of complete and absolute chaos. The reviewing stand dissolved into a scramble of bodies, some diving for cover, some frozen in shock, some running. 11 people were killed. 28 were wounded. Hosni Mubarak, seated directly beside Sadat, was unharmed. But Sadat wasn't. Chapter 5. Colonel Zoomer's Silence. King Lear, stripped of his power and raging on the heath, delivers a line that cuts to the specific anguish of a man who trusted institutions that failed him. I am a man more sinned against than sinning. It is the cry of someone who built a world, believed in its structure, placed his life in the hands of its mechanisms, and discovered too late that those mechanisms had been quietly hollowed out from the inside. Sadat had no opportunity to say anything of the kind, but the story of how the conspiracy reached the reviewing stand is, in large part, the story of exactly that betrayal. Aboud al-Zammour was a colonel in Egyptian military intelligence. He was the founder and first emir of Egyptian Islamic Jihad. His plan, as he would later describe it, was to use his official position as commander of an intelligence battalion in the central military zone to get young Islamist officers into crucial commands and positions, a plan he'd been executing since as early as 1979. As part of this plan, he forwarded Khaled Islambouli's artillery platoon to serve in the October 6th parade, and he arranged so that routine intelligence checks on the live ammunition in the platoon were not carried out. Listen to that again. The man who assigned Islambouli's unit to the parade, the man who ensured the ammunition checks were bypassed, was a colonel in Egyptian military intelligence, was simultaneously the founder of the organization that had ordered the assassination. He was, in the most literal possible sense, the system that was supposed to prevent the killing and the conspiracy that carried it out, at the same time in one body, using the same institutional authority. In February of 1981, 8 months before the assassination, Egyptian authorities had been alerted to Egyptian Islamic Jihad's plan by the arrest of an operative carrying crucial information. They knew a plot existed. They conducted the massive September roundup in direct response to that intelligence. They arrested over 1,500 people, but they missed the cell that mattered. They missed Islambouli. They missed, somehow, the lieutenant whose brother they had just arrested, whose commanding officer was the founder of the organization that they were trying to dismantle, whose unit was scheduled to appear on the parade route 3 weeks later. Whether this was catastrophic incompetence or something with darker contours has never been fully resolved. Al-Zawahiri himself, interviewed after his release from prison following the 2011 Egyptian revolution, gave an account that was revealing in its careful specificity. He stated that Sadat's assassination had happened against their plans, that their original plan was to make a revolution in a civil way, without blood, but that Sadat's arrest of everyone in September of '81 forced them to move quickly. What this statement acknowledges, even in its self-serving framing, is that the organization had been planning for years, that it had penetrated the military at the officer level, and that the September arrests, far from disrupting the conspiracy, accelerated it. Among the hundreds arrested in the aftermath of the assassination was a 30-year-old surgeon and Islamic Jihad member named Ayman al-Zawahiri. Al-Zawahiri was convicted of illegal arms possession and imprisoned for 3 years. During that time, he was subjected to torture by intelligence officers interested in information about his contacts, an experience that intensified his militancy. He was released in 1984. He left Egypt. He went to Afghanistan. He met a wealthy Saudi named Osama bin Laden. The rest of that story has a date: September 11th, 2001. The trial that followed the assassination was conducted in a military court and produced, by the standards of Egyptian military justice, a relatively contained set of outcomes. 5 men were executed: Islambouli, Faraj, and 3 co-conspirators. Al-Zawahiri received life imprisonment. The Egyptian government succeeded in rounding up the membership of Egyptian Islamic Jihad, but was rather lenient in the ensuing trial. And lenient is a word that requires some examination in this context, because among those imprisoned and then released were the men who would spend the next 2 decades building the organization that planned the embassy bombings in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, the attack on the USS Cole, and the September 11th attacks. They were radicalized further in Egyptian prisons, networked in those prisons, and emerged from those prisons more dangerous than when they entered. Chapter 6. What the Parade Left Behind. Shakespeare ends his play The Tempest with Prospero, the magician and ruler of a strange island, speaking a final epilogue that contains one of the most quietly devastating lines in all of his plays. What's past is prologue. It's usually cited as a statement about inevitability. The past sets the stage for what must follow. But in context, it means something more specific and more unsettling. Prospero has just released his enemies, forgiven them, restored order. He's looking forward, not back. And he's saying, with the earned weariness of a man who has seen how cycles work, that everything that has happened, every act, every betrayal, every consequence, is merely the introduction to what comes next. The assassination of Anwar Sadat was prologue. In the immediate aftermath, Hosni Mubarak assumed the presidency and declared a state of emergency that would remain technically in force for the next 30 years. The Camp David peace held. It holds to this day. The longest continuous peace agreement between Israel and any of its Arab neighbors. The Arab League eventually readmitted Egypt. The Sinai was returned as agreed. By the narrow diplomatic metric of the agreement's specific terms, what Sadat died for was not undone by his dying. But the world that the assassination helped create is considerably harder to assess by narrow metrics. Al-Zawahiri was imprisoned from 1981 to 1984 for his role in the Sadat assassination. He was released from prison in 1984. In 1985, he went to Saudi Arabia, then to Peshawar, where he treated refugees affected by the Afghan war. He'd first met bin Laden in Jeddah in 1986. And the meeting in Jeddah between an Egyptian surgeon radicalized in Cairo's prisons and a Saudi millionaire radicalized in the mountains of Afghanistan is, in retrospect, one of the most consequential encounters of the late 20th century. They formed a bond, merging al-Zawahiri's ties to Islamic Jihad and bin Laden's al-Qaeda. Together they shared a motive: to kill Americans, military, civilian alike. The line from the parade ground in Cairo on October 6, 1981 to the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001, it's not a straight line. History rarely moves in straight lines, but it is a traceable line. And the tracing of it runs directly through the imprisonment and radicalization of the men who stood in a military courtroom cage in Cairo in 1982, shouting in Arabic and occasionally in English for the television cameras, proclaiming that they had done God's work and would do it again. One of those men, the composed and precise surgeon with the wire-rimmed glasses who spoke to the cameras in English, was Ayman al-Zawahiri. He was uncompromising and belligerent. His command of the language of international communication revealed his background: educated and middle class. He was 30 years old. He had 20 years of work still ahead of him. As for Sadat himself, the man who conspired with Nazi agents to drive out the British, who stood in the shadow of Nasser for 20 years and emerged as the most consequential Egyptian leader since Nasser himself, who crossed the Suez Canal, then flew to Jerusalem and shook the hand of Menachem Begin. His legacy is one of the most genuinely complicated in the modern history of the Middle East. The peace he made has endured. The democratic reforms he promised largely have not. The Islamist forces he initially cultivated as a counter to the secular left grew, under his watch and in the prisons his successor built, into something that metastasized across the globe. He understood at some level what he was risking. In the final moments of his life, friends and advisors noted a quality in him that they described as fatalism. Not despair exactly, but a settled awareness that the direction he had chosen was irreversible, and that irreversibility carried consequences that he couldn't fully control. He'd crossed too many rivers to go back. He had stepped in too far. Al-Zamir, the military intelligence colonel who had put the assassins on that truck and arranged for the ammunition checks to be bypassed, was released from prison after the fall of Mubarak in 2011, 30 years after the assassination. In a televised interview that year, he offered what he described as an apology to the Egyptian people. He said the assassination had been a mistake. Not morally, no, strategically. It had not produced the revolution they had intended. It had provided instead the conditions for the Mubarak police state that imprisoned and tortured a generation of Egyptian Islamists and drove their most capable survivors into the arms of Osama bin Laden. He apologized for the miscalculation, but he expressed no remorse for the killing. There's a photograph taken at the 1978 Camp David summit that is, in its composition, almost unbearably ironic. Jimmy Carter stands between Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin. All three men are smiling. Carter's arms are around both of them. It's the image of a triumphant moment, the kind of photograph that gets hung in libraries and printed in history textbooks and placed on the walls of museums dedicated to the proposition that peace is possible. Sadat is 60 years old in that photograph. He has 3 years left. What the photograph cannot show is everything that is already in motion around it. The pamphlets circulating in the Cairo mosques, the cells forming in the military barracks, the colonel in military intelligence quietly arranging the conditions for what's coming, the young surgeon attending Friday prayers and thinking about what the near enemy has done and what the neglected duty requires. What's past is prologue. The parade continues in different cities on different roads with different men in the trucks. The argument about who has the right to make peace, who has the authority to end the life of the man who makes it, that's the argument that the 20th century could not resolve and handed still burning to the 21st. Anwar Sadat stood up to receive a salute on a perfect October morning. He'd earned it. He had changed the map of the Middle East with the force of his own determination. He had chosen, at enormous personal cost, the harder and lonelier path. He deserved better than a parking lot. He deserved better than a parade. Thanks for listening to The Ides of April. This has been the assassination of Anwar Sadat. The Ides of April is an EVO production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. For the Ides of April, I'm your writer and host, Brandon Morgan.